Hello, welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews, and this is my video for the worst show of 2022. This is a part of my best and worst of 2022 series. It is part 3 of 4, so I've already done the most overrated show of 2022 and the most underrated show of 2022. This week, I'm doing the worst show of 2022 leading up to my top 10 best shows, which will be next week. So these, of course, are all based on my opinion and my opinion alone. These are my picks. These are the picks that I have decided on what I view as the most overrated, most underrated, and worst show of 2022. So I'm not going to do a lot of preamble for this one. Anyone who is familiar with my channel, especially my Star Trek reviews, already knows what this is going to be. So I'm just going to jump right to it, and then I'm going to rant and rave on the show for the 10 millionth time this calendar year. So I'll go ahead and do the drum roll just because that's the thing I do for dramatic effect. We pretend that we're building to something. So go ahead, do the thing, do the thing. The worst show of 2022 is Star Trek Picard Season 2. Again, if you know my channel at all, you saw this coming a million miles away. I've ranted and raved about this show a whole lot. This year I reviewed it weekly, then I did a live discussion with my brother Mark, where he and I ranted and raved on it for another couple hours. I'm almost kind of really sick of ranting and raving on it, so I almost wanted to pick something else just because, but I have to pick this as the worst because this is not only the worst show of the year, it is one of the worst shows in a very, very long time. In fact, I have it ranked as the second worst show in the modern television era, so modern television or streaming era. The number one worst season of television would be Game of Thrones Season 8. I got Picard Season 2 at number 2, and then number 3 would be Game of Thrones Season 7. would be the third worst. And I really do prefer to make that kind of comparison. I know my brother wants to compare it to other Star Trek seasons. To me, it's apples and oranges comparing this 10-episode serialized season in the modern era of television to a 26-episode episodic season of Star Trek in the 90s. Those are apples and oranges. I can't compare the two, but it makes a lot more sense for my brain to compare this to modern day serialized television, typically 12 episodes or less, or 10 episodes, 8 episodes, 6 episodes, in that range. That is the apt comparison. And when doing that, this is the second worst behind Game of Thrones Season 8. And you know how abysmal that season was, so this is saying a lot. This is an absolute terrible season of television. Now, I'll go ahead and I guess rehash some of the reasons why it's the worst. I'm going to get spoilery, but, you know, if you haven't seen it by now, please don't watch it. Don't torture yourself that way. So I'm just going to spoil the crap out of it. I mean, if you haven't seen it, it probably won't make a lot of sense to you anyways. But a lot of my, or most of my regular viewers, subscribers, have seen the season and tend to agree with me that it was an awful season of television. So there's no way that I can talk about every problem with it, so I'm going to highlight the ones that stood out most to me, that I hated the most about this show. This is still going to take me 20 minutes plus, I'm sure, to go through all of it, because even just trying to limit how much I talk about, I'm still going to rant and rave for a long period of time. So let me just go ahead and jump into why this is the worst season of 2022, as if you needed a reminder. Okay, where do I even begin? There's so much. I'll start from the beginning. So, we have the first episode where the writers have decided that they are determined, they're hell bound to force feed a romance involving Jean Luc Picard down our throats. Jean Luc Picard must be in a romance come hell or high water, so we're going to force it down the viewers' throats no matter what. So, what they've decided to do, since there isn't really an obvious candidate for that, is they take this couple from the previous season, from season one. There was Siobhan and Laris, who were this Romulan couple who seemed like a very happily married couple. They were very good together. They were kind of like working for Picard at his winery in season one. So they take them and they just unceremoniously kill the dude, Siobhan, off screen. So he's out of the picture now. So now that opens Laris up to be a romantic partner for Jean-Luc. Never mind that her husband died a year ago. Let's just mention his name just once and pretend like he never existed after that and force feed this awful romance that just was not believable. I just could not buy it. It was cringy trying to watch the chemistry that did not exist. It was just awful. So they then, for all intents and purposes, abandon that for the entire season until the finale, where they bring it back and go, oh yeah, they're madly in love and let's just put them together and they're going to live happily ever after, except I don't think she's in season 3. So it's like, what? So they force feed this romance. Now, I say that for all intents and purposes, they abandon it. They do abandon Laris for most of the season. However, the actress Aura Brady plays a different character instead, and they kind of like hint that, oh well, he has a thing for her because she looks like the woman he had a fake thing for in the 24th century, and none of it makes any sense. There's no chemistry between them either way. And by the way, this is one of 3 examples of Star Trek Picard Season 2 using the same actor to play an ancestor of a 24th century character. So we have 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 examples of this awful Star Trek trope that Star Trek has done a bunch of times, but Picard, of course, has to really lean into it because it's not a very good trope. So they try to maintain this phony relationship by having Picard kind of sort of have a romance going with her ancestor that inexplicably looks exactly like her, who sometimes has Romulan ears and sometimes has human ears. Okay, so that's out of the way. Let's go ahead and jump into the time travel of it all, because this is going to take a while. This will probably take up the bulk of the video. I'll probably do my rant on the time travel, and then I'll get into the characters, and then we'll skedaddle. We'll get out of here, and that's enough. This season conflates 2 types of time travel, type 1 and type 2. They cross the streams, they intermix it, which is always a sign of bad writing, in my opinion. Now, if you need a reminder of what the types of time travel are, I did just talk about them in last week's video for the underrated show of the year, but I'll go ahead and review them one more time very quickly. When I'm talking about the 3 types of time travel, I'm talking about type 1 is whatever happened, no matter what you do. When you go back in the past, you cannot change the past. A Star Trek example would be Time 0, where Data's head always existed in that cave. And Guinan always remembered meeting Picard from the future back in the 19th century. That is not the typical type that Star Trek uses, however. Most often they use type 2, which is when you do go back, you do change the past, you can change the past, and you will create a new timeline, but it will be one that overwrites the current timeline. And that's primarily what they use here in Picard Season 2. Then, of course, there's type 3, where you create a timeline that doesn't overwrite the original timeline, it actually creates a coexisting timeline, and that's what Star Trek 2009 did, which doesn't make any sense to me that they would use that when they've consistently used type 2 all throughout the Star Trek universe. I think Star Trek really needs to stick to type 2 because that is the one that they first used. That's the one they most famously used in episodes like Yesterday's Enterprise, Sitting on the Edge of Forever, and of course Star Trek IV The Voyage Home. That's the one that they really should stick to, but every once in a while they dip into a little type 1 and dip into type 3 so that J.J. Abrams can be in a lazy ass and not have to worry about sticking to canon and can do whatever the fuck he wants. I don't like those movies. So they do the other types. I feel like they should primarily stick to type 2. It's okay if they do a type 1 every once in a while as long as they stick with it. Here, they are wishy-washy all over the place with type 1 and 2, which is a sign of bad writing, as I said. So the type 1 comes in because apparently Rios has always been in the past. That has always happened. Guinan has always had a picture of Rios on her table or whatever, that whenever Picard went to visit her in the bar that was called 10 Forward, which don't even get me started on why it was called 10 Forward in the 21st century. But whatever. So anyways, so she always had this picture of Rios that Picard just didn't notice. So they weren't saying that he changed the timeline and then that picture appeared when he returned to the present. No. That picture was always there. They are claiming type 1 time travel, that Rios always existed back in the past. And then the Borgatti thing, I think, also falls into this category, but that's a whole separate rant, and it's a whole other mess that I'll get to a little bit later. So we'll save the Borgatti thing for later. But anyways, so the whole premise is the type 2 where they do change the past somehow. Then there's also the issue of how did that happen? Because when Q first sends him into the alternate timeline, I had the impression that Q just simply snapped his fingers and changed the timeline. But apparently that's not what happened. So are we to believe that Q actually did already go back into time and go through all the trouble of getting a job at NASA and diverting Renee Picard from doing her mission, and he did all of that already, and that's what changed the timeline? So when Picard goes back, he is now re-entering into a timeline that Q has already changed? Kind of like what Marty does in Back to the Future 2, where he goes back to 1955 and sees future Biff. He's already changed that timeline, but now Marty is going back to try to catch him from changing it. Maybe that's what they're trying to say happened, I guess, but that is not the impression I got at first. It seemed like the Q just kind of snapped his fingers, and it's still unclear. They still do not make it clear at all what actually happened, because who cares? Turn your brain off. This is bad writing. Who cares? So the whole premise is the type 2 time travel logic, which does not mix well with the type 1. So which is it? Then, of course, you have the butterflies, which is something that Picard gives a speech on in the beginning of the season when they first travel back, like episode 3 or 4 or whatever, when they finally get around to the time travel. He makes big speech about avoiding butterflies, which is avoiding anything that could change the timeline when they're trying to fix the timeline, so they don't also want to unexpectedly change the timeline in other ways. So they go in with that attitude and then completely throw that all out the window, and they're the most reckless time travelers in the history of Star Trek, as they do not give a fuck about changing the timeline again and again and again and again and again and again. So just for one example, Raffi and Seven beam out in broad daylight in front of 20 cops and God knows how many other people in the middle of the street watch them beam away. No, that couldn't possibly cause any butterflies. And then they rescue Rios, and also end up freeing every captive of ice on that bus, which, not that I think that's a bad thing for them to free captives of ice, because ice sucks, but they weren't originally freed in the original timeline. So that's a whole lot of butterflies all over the place, because there's all these people running free now that weren't originally free. They don't give a fuck about that. And of course, there's many other examples, but the most egregious one is toward the end of the season, where they just willy-nilly start killing these new Borg creations that the Borgati, or the Borg Queen, has created out of men living in the 21st century. Therefore, they have just murdered a whole bunch of guys from the 21st century without a second thought. Those are guys who originally lived and possibly had families and kids and long family trees, and that's all wiped out. So by the time they return to the 24th century, they shouldn't be returning to anything that remotely resembles the original timeline, because they have just changed it a gazillion ways over. Like, they've changed it so many different ways. Not to mention that apparently Rios was back there always existing, which makes my head hurt. Like, what? Okay, so now I gotta rant about the Borgati Queen of it all. Now, I'm on the record of saying on multiple occasions that I am not at all a fan of the Borg Queen. In fact, I think it's one of the worst things Star Trek has ever done, is creating the Borg Queen to completely contradict everything that had been set up about the Borg prior to Star Trek First Contact in order to make a quick buck at the movie theater. Anyways, I don't want to get too much into that. The point is, I hate the Borg Queen. However, I was willing to give this Borgati Queen a chance because I thought it was an interesting concept. Now, we knew pretty early on in the season, I mean, it was pretty obvious that the masked Borg Queen that we saw at the beginning of the season was some combination of Dr. Jurati and the Borg Queen. And I was kind of interested in seeing where they were going with that and what they would do with it. So what we end up with at the end is a version of the Borg Queen that is a combination of Dr. Jurati and a version of the Borg Queen from an alternate timeline, the Confederation timeline. So this is not the Borg Queen that we know. It's the Confederation timeline version of the Borg Queen, and she travels far enough back into the past where she can still exist, even though once the timeline is fixed, her timeline would be eliminated. It would no longer exist, but she still exists in the past. I'm okay with it up to this point because there is precedent for that in Star Trek. We saw the same thing happen with Tasha Yar, where the timeline that she lived in with the Klingon War was wiped out. It would no longer existed anymore, but she traveled back into the past before the timelines split so she could still exist, being from that timeline, even though her timeline was gone. So there's precedent. So I have no problem so far. We can have this new version of the Borg Queen that includes this Borg Queen from a timeline that no longer exists. And she is now merged with Dr. Jurati. So far, so good. Here's where I have the problem. So apparently they existed, this Jurati Borg Queen with her new brand of Borg, for 400 years. Doing what? How did they coexist with the regular Borg, the Borg Queen that we know, and that Borg? How did they coexist with all the other planets in the galaxy? How did they exist for 400 years with nobody knowing about them? And how did they not, again, change the timeline a gazillion times over? It's another reason why when Picard and crew return to the 24th century, they should be in a timeline. It's not the Confederation timeline, but it shouldn't remotely resemble the original timeline, because apparently the Borgati Queen and her Borg have existed for 400 years, changing the timeline again and again and again. Anything that they would have done would have changed the timeline a gazillion times over. Now, the only thing that I think could maybe solve that is if they said that the Borgatti Queen travel immediately into the future, or maybe spent a few years in the past to build up their little Borg army of good Borg, and then travel directly into the future rather than being around for 400 years. But they really strongly implied, in fact, I think they might have even said that they did exist for 400 years. So how in the fuck did they not change the timeline a gazillion times over? How did they interact with the other Borg? And none of it makes any sense. None, no sense at all. So I wanted to give it a shot. I thought it could have been interesting, and I still think it could have been. I think there's a way that they could have written this that it could have made sense, but this was not it. It was nonsensical. It was a ball of confusion. It was a big ball of flaming garbage. This is complete nonsense. All right. Speaking of complete nonsense, I'm going to go through the character stuff. Mainly, I'm going to talk about Captain Picard, or Admiral Picard, rather. And then I want to talk about how the show ruined Q and Guinan. Especially Q. So let me go into that, and then I'm going to stop my ranting after that. All right, so what are they doing with Picard? What did they do to this character this season? I don't know if they've ruined him per se, but they certainly didn't add anything to his character. I already mentioned the bad romance, but also we have this pointless backstory. And this is apparently the whole point of Q's mission, was to get Picard to see and reconcile with this pointless backstory that was definitely retconned in, that definitely does not fit his character, does not fit anything that was established, and adds nothing to his character. Even if you want to accept that, okay, this did really happen, and this doesn't contradict everything they've ever set up about him before, fine, but what does it add to his character? Virtually nothing. There was really no reason for any of this trauma with his mom. They did nothing to make this character better. This is one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek. I won't go far as to say as they ruined him, but they certainly did him no favors into this season. And I said I wanted to talk about Q and Guinan, but I do have to mention really quickly one of the worst villains in all of Star Trek, which is whatever the fuck Soong this is. I don't remember his name. I don't care. It's another Soong played by Fred Spiner. Yet another one. He was a somewhat interesting character at the beginning, but he quickly devolves into the cheesiest mustache twirly villain of all time, and that's saying a lot. So let's talk about Q and Guinan. Let me talk about Guinan first. So first of all, I will say I do appreciate that they recast younger Guinan. I find it kind of ironic that they were willing to recast a younger version of the same character, yet they insist on having one actor play two different ancestors or relatives of two different characters. Why do they do that? But I actually thought it was a good choice. I actually thought this actress did well. My problem is that this is not Guinan. We've already seen Guinan in the 19th century, and she was existing in a world that was just out of slavery in the United States, and yet she still maintained a hopeful, positive attitude that things were going to get better. And somehow we were to believe that she's gone from that chipper, positive 19th century Guinan to this suddenly out of nowhere pessimistic Guinan, because things are worse than slavery in the 21st century. I'm not saying things are great, don't get me wrong, but she was positive after slavery, but she is pessimistic after what's happening in the 21st century? Really? And then so she goes from positive, optimistic Guinan to pessimistic, drink herself under the table, whatever Guinan, back to positive, optimistic Guinan, who is exactly the same as she was in the 19th century. Does not compute, does not fit, does not make any sense. The show is actually seeming to pretend that Time Zero never happened. Well, guess what? It did. So you can't do this. So I don't know if I'd go quite so far as to say they ruined Guinan's character, but they certainly didn't do her any favors. So some might say they did ruin her character. I don't know. Now let's get into Q. I already talked a little bit about the nonsense about did he snap his fingers and change the timeline, or did he actually had already gone back and got a job at NASA and changed the timeline and did it the hard way. Unclear, but his motivations. So all of this was apparently to teach Picard a lesson. Now, that in and of itself, putting aside the fact that the lesson is dumb, the whole thing about his mom's, the trauma with his mom is dumb, doesn't make any sense. But the fact that Q would do that is consistent with what he did in All Good Things. However, they're very inconsistent in a very key way here, to the point where I say they ruined All Good Things. They completely undermined All Good Things. All Good Things actually ended in a good place with the Q and Picard relationship, which is completely undone at the end of Star Trek Picard Season 2. So I am just going to pretend that this doesn't exist, and I will watch All Good Things and just latch onto that and say, no, that's how the Q and Picard relationship ended, because that's a much better way to end. That's why I don't get excited for Moriarty coming in Season 3. Why? So they can ruin Ship in a Bottle next? Why would I want them to do that? So anyways, what I am talking about here is that in All Good Things, there's kind of this like unspoken understanding where Picard does accept now that Q actually had his back. Q was actually looking out for him, but it was more in a tough love kind of way. It's more in a, I'm going to make the world hard on you. I mean, not almost make the timeline into a confederation, which would be way too far, but I'm gonna make things difficult for you because I know you'll succeed, and it's for the betterment of you and the betterment of mankind. And it's kind of a wink, wink, and nod, nod. I got your back, bro, kind of thing. There's nothing overt about it. It's sort of a implied thing that the two of them understand together mutually. So Picard Season 2 breaks that rule. They go beyond implication and just have Picard or Q go, I want to give you a hug. No, you missed the point of All Good Things. It's supposed to be a wink, wink, nod, nod, implied sort of thing, not a, that's just all I ever wanted was a hug. So I changed the whole timeline so that the Confederation would rule the universe and millions of people would die who hadn't died before so that I can get a hug. What? What? Okay, I'm done. I'm over it. May I never have to talk about this terrible season of television ever again. See what you made me do? No, I'm kidding. Nobody made me do anything. I took it upon myself to do the worst show of 2022 because I did the worst show of 2021, and that has to be Picard. So I had to rant about it more, even though I've ranted about it so much this year. Here's hoping season 3 isn't as bad as this, but quite frankly, I don't have a lot of hope for it. I expect them to ruin Moriarty. I expect for them to ruin Lore. I expect for them to ruin all of our Next Generation characters because that's how bad season 2 was. Anyways, let me end with my usual rating out of 10. This is not a shock to anybody. The rating out of 10 is a 1 because 1 is the lowest score that I would ever give anything. If I could, I would give it a negative 10, but I set the rules. The rules are very clear. 1's the lowest, 10's the highest. So we are definitely going with a 1, the lowest 1 possible. Other than Game of Thrones Season 8 would get a lower 1 than this. This is the second worst show in the modern television era, in my opinion, is Star Trek Picard Season 2, and may I never have to watch a season as bad as this one. Okay, so that's my ranting. Next week, please join me where I get to be positive. I'm really looking forward to that because I get to go through my top 10 best shows of 2022, and I'm actually going to show you All of the shows that I watched ranked. I think I'll be up to maybe 30 or 31, but 31 through 11, I'm just going to scroll it up your screen really quickly so you can just see it very quickly, and then I will count down the top 10. So, can't wait for that. I am also going to do my transition year in review, kind of look back at my transition over the year of 2022. So that will be coming out at the same time as my top 10 best. So please subscribe if you have not already. Check out all of that, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.